We all have a tendency to think that things were better when we were young. I know I do. Our music was understandable. It had words that I totally could understand. It really had lyrics. It had melodies. You know, it wasn't just beating on a metal drum. Children were more respectful. We grew up listening to adults and being patient at the dinner table and being seen and not heard. It certainly isn't true of my grandkids. We had real food instead of fast food. Children played outside. I remember that. Now they sit inside and play with computers and Game Boys and electronic devices, and so on. And so when you look around, you think, boy, it was a lot better when we were young. But not everything was better. Not everything. At least not in my world. I remember that segregation was the law of the land. Gays were non-existent because if they came out of the closet, the consequences for them were dire. Emotions were bottled up so that everybody just pretended that things were always okay. Just like on TV. Y'all remember Ozzie and Harriet? Father Knows Best? Okay, I do. And nothing was real. It was all pretend. It was all for show. And all in all, it was pretty nice to live in a world where we never talked about death. There were no child molesters. Wives were never battered by alcoholic husbands. In fact, there was no alcoholism. Didn't exist. And as long as everything stayed in the home, everybody pretended that everything was okay. Well, it wasn't. I grew up in the South in the 40s and the 50s, and when I was a child, segregation was all that I knew. My father was a political appointee of Harry Truman, so he worked in Washington, D.C., and we lived in Maryland, mostly rural Maryland. Everything in my world was segregated. Everything. The schools, the beaches, trains, buses, streetcars, hotels, restaurants, ballparks, major league teams, public drinking fountains, concert halls, movie theaters, churches, elevators, and department stores. Everything you can think of was segregated. And because I was a white child, I never even associated with a black kid. I never knew one. Never even saw him. Wasn't part of my world. It was a little bit different for me because I was Jewish, but it was a given in those days that country clubs were segregated. Blacks couldn't even think about it. But they went even further than race, and they openly stated things like, no Jews, Gentiles only. Management jobs in virtually every corporation in America were absolutely shut down for blacks, and most of them were not available for Jews. And we all knew it. And so we didn't even bother to apply. I was just doing some legal work for my daughter who lives in Walnut Creek, and it was regarding an easement on her house. And in order to do the work, I had to do a little research on the deed and how she got title. And I was surprised to see the original deed to her subdivision was made in 1947, 2 years after we fought a great war to free the world from dictators who purged people because of race, okay, and religion. And guess what it had? It had a covenant in the deed which excluded, and I quote, all persons not entirely of the Caucasian race. That was an interesting find for me for two reasons. First, it was from the Bay Area in California, not from the Deep South. And second, my son-in-law, my daughter's husband, is half Japanese. So if that covenant were still legally valid, he couldn't live in his own house. Just struck me. Now, when my dad received his presidential political appointment in 1948, he had to submit his resignation at the same time that he accepted his appointment. And that way, if the president ever wanted to fire him, all he had to do was invoke the resignation. And I assume that's the same way today. I'm pretty sure it is. So when Eisenhower was elected in 1952, all of the Democratic appointees were dismissed and all of them were replaced with Republicans. That's the way it works in Washington. No hard feelings. That's the way it works. So we had to leave Maryland. We moved to New York, where my dad got a job lobbying the very same agency he had just administered. And that is also the way it works in Washington. In July of 1954, we went back to Washington on a vacation and to visit friends. One Sunday morning, we were all sitting around the breakfast table laughing and enjoying each other, when all of a sudden my dad fell off his chair. My brother, who was then 9, and I, thought that he was playing, so we jumped on him and started to tickle him and wrestle. And that's what 9-year-old and 12-year-old boys do. But we immediately realized that something was very wrong, and in fact, my dad was dead before he hit the floor. My mother decided to bury him in Washington because we had roots there and friends there, and we'd only lived in New York for a very short time, so she really didn't feel that that was the right place for him to be. That was 58 years ago, but I remember that funeral like it was yesterday. I remember who was there, and I remember who was not there. I was only 12. It's like a videotape in my mind. I can't turn it off. Well, I never went back to his grave during all of my junior and senior high school years. And in 1959, when I graduated high school, I left the East Coast for good. In 1979, which was 25 years after my dad had died, I was in Washington for just one day, and I went to the cemetery in hopes of finding his grave. But the cemetery office was closed, and I had to leave town the next morning, so I never found the grave. And I didn't go back to Washington until last month. Now, before I tell you about that, 3 years ago, I went back to New York for my 50th high school reunion. And thanks to email, I was able to arrange with some friends, good friends, that we get there a day or two early so that we could visit with each other and go around town and pretend that we were 17 and 18 again, which is, I guess, what you do at a reunion. We didn't know because we'd never done it, but that's what we did. Okay. We rented a car. We decided to drive to all of our old houses so that we could check them out. So we went to a few houses. We took pictures. Everybody stood in front of the house, and somebody else took a picture, and we knocked on doors and told people we used to live here 50 years ago. That was kind of fun. We reminisced, and then we drove out to Paul's house. Paul lived several miles out of town. This was Great Neck, New York, Long Island. Paul lived several miles out of town on a peninsula that stuck out into Long Island Sound, which is the body of water between Long Island and Connecticut. His house had views of Connecticut to the north and the Manhattan skyline to the east. The house looked like the French embassy that I knew from Washington, D.C. It was huge. It had 3 tennis courts, a very large swimming pool, 300 feet of frontage on the water, and a deep water dock for his yacht. And we all knew the property very well because we used to spend a lot of time there in high school. In the summer, we went swimming and boating. And in the winter, we hung out and we shot pool in his enormous pool room. Well, when we got to Paul's house, it was raining. So Paul just jumped out of the car, stood in front of the house. We took his picture. He got back in the car, and then we drove back into town. And as we came into town, we passed some old apartment buildings, which meant absolutely nothing to me, when suddenly Paul told me to stop the car. I did. I had no idea why, but I did. He got out and he said, "Take my picture." And we all asked him why. And he said, "This is where I moved my senior year when my father went bankrupt and we moved into a 2-bedroom apartment. My father and mother had 1 bedroom and my brother and sister and I had the other bedroom. From the French embassy to a 2-bedroom apartment." We were flabbergasted. Paul's father invented plastic buttons. Okay? Fabulously wealthy. Absolutely. None of us had any idea that he had gone bankrupt. And Paul was amazed that we didn't know about it. And so he asked us, "Didn't you guys ever figure out that the entire senior year you never came to my house, not even once?" And we looked at each other in complete disbelief. But the fact was that none of us had known of the bankruptcy, and none of us had realized that we didn't go to Paul's house senior year. Not once. Because we were busy with girls and with basketball and whatever you do when you're 17 and 18. We didn't go to Paul's house. Well, we drove silently back into town, just shocked with the realization that we hadn't known that. And on impulse, I decided to make a right turn onto Beach Road. Beach Road was kind of in the poor section of town. And when I got to 15 Beach Road, I stopped in front of this old ramshackle apartment building, and I said to my friends, "Take my picture." And they said, "Why?" I said, "Because this is where I moved with my mother and my brother into a little tiny, crummy apartment when my father died." And they looked at me and they said, "Your father died?" And then we really started to talk. We learned more about each other in one day after not seeing each other for 50 years than we had known for 6 years of high school when we were all best friends, junior and senior high school. How could that happen? In the 50s, when my dad died, there was no such thing as counseling. Grief was something that was private. It wasn't public. And so we never admitted to grief. Whatever happened in the home stayed in the home. And it wasn't ever a spoken order. It was just that way. And it was not just for me, but for everyone. That's the way it was, at least in my world. We lived in an Ozzie and Harriet world. Everything was perfect. We could never publicly admit that things were bad. So for me, I just pretended in my mind that my dad was on a trip, and I never grieved because I didn't know how, and I didn't have the opportunity. It just wasn't an available option. Now, just so you know the rest of the story, as Paul Harvey would say, after that reunion, I really started to think about this, and I realized that I needed to grieve for my father's death, something I had not done. I needed closure. My sister-in-law is a marriage and family counselor, and she pushed me into the arms of a competent counselor, a grief counselor, and so I went. And she taught me how to grieve. Now, I've just come back from Washington, D.C., and I spent much of a day visiting my father's grave, and I have to say it was absolutely wonderful. It felt like this huge weight came off my shoulders. And I had thought for a while about moving him to San Luis Obispo. My mom is buried here. But as I sat at his grave, it was beautiful. It was very peaceful. The cemetery is gorgeous, and they take very good care of it. And I thought, you know, how disrespectful of me to selfishly want to move him, and so I'm not going to do it. He's fine, and I'm fine. I'm crying right now, but I'm absolutely fine. It's a good thing. Something else happened at that reunion which made an impression on me. I learned for the first time, that many of my friends from high school were gay. When we were in high school in the 50s, I never even heard that term. I didn't know what a gay was. And even when I learned about it, I would have gone to my grave swearing that there were no gays in my high school. And I was so wrong. There were quite a few gays. And some of them were the leaders of our class. They were the best athletes, the editor of the paper, and so on. And life must have been very difficult for them because they couldn't come out, and so they had to lead secret lives. Again, everything was pretend. Everything was Ozzie and Harriet. Obviously, a lot has changed in my lifetime the last 70 years, and even though it covers 70 years, in the grand scheme of history, it's just a very short time. It's insignificant. It's like a moment. Now, every once in a while, the U.S. Supreme Court issues a ruling which fundamentally changes our society. For me, the first such ruling came in May of 1954. I remember the moment I learned about it. I was in 8th grade social studies. And the case was Brown versus the Board of Education. And that was the case, thank you, Earl Warren, that outlawed segregation in public schools. It was very meaningful to me, especially going to segregated schools. And my parents were 100% against segregation. I always knew that that was wrong. So I welcomed this decision even as an 8th grader. And when the Brown versus Board of Education decision was announced, we all knew that it was a big deal and that life would somehow change. But we had no idea how that was going to happen. And it wasn't until Johnson and the Civil Rights Act of the mid to the late 1960s that integration actually occurred. And it had to be forced, and you all remember how that happened. It wasn't pretty. Many people were killed throughout the South. But it was worth it because it changed our society forever, and I think for the better. The South today is a different place. I spend a lot of time there. My wife is from New Orleans. We go back every year. I'm going in 3 weeks and 1 day, November 6th. I can't wait. Okay. And when we go, we just don't visit family, but I like to go around and check out Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia and see how things are. And this is how things are. Today, if you drive through the rural South, you're going to see a white kid on a bicycle riding a black kid on the handlebars. You will see that. And you will see at the schoolyard a pickup baseball game with black and white kids. And they play together, they live together. You will see them eating at restaurants. And you'll also see, if you go into a restaurant, which I did, in Thibodaux, Louisiana. Interesting place on Bayou Lafourche, okay, in the middle of nowhere. And I walk into a restaurant, and there's this elderly guy, probably in his 80s or 90s, and he's spouting off about the, pardon me for using this word, but I will, because that's what he said. He's spouting off about the niggers. The niggers this and the niggers that. And they're lazy, they don't work in the summer because they're drinking, they don't work in the winter because whatever. And just on and on and on. And two young construction workers walk into the restaurant, one black, one white, perhaps 25. And they're obviously a team working for a utility company. And they take a look at this old guy who's doddering away with his racism, and they look at him. I looked at them, they looked at me, and they go, they ordered and they moved as far away from him as they possibly could. And the young black people and the young white people were together. You wouldn't have seen that 20, 30, 40 years ago, but you see it every day now in the South. Now, when you have a fundamental change in a social structure, it takes a very long time. It took a long time to implement civil rights laws, and now here we are, 58 years later, we still have a very, very long way to go. Obtaining a societal change is very complicated. I'll give you an example. My father-in-law was a fine Southern man. He was devoted to his family and to the Catholic Church. He was a deacon in his church. He sent both his daughters to Catholic schools for their entire life. But he left the church when it became integrated. There were subtle and not so subtle social pressures at work which affected all of his behavior. Very complicated. I'll give you one example. When I first met him in Louisiana, I went fishing with him because he was a great fisherman. And we go out in his boat, and he's got two ice chests. One has a blue top and one has a red top. And as we're catching fish, if you catch a redfish or a trout, those are good fish. They're easy to clean, they're great to eat, so they go in the blue box, says my father-in-law Fred. Put them in the blue box. If you catch a sheephead, which is extremely difficult to clean and not so tasty, it goes in the red box. I had no idea why. So we fished and we fished and we fished and we filled up the blue box with redfish and trout, and we filled up the red box with fish he didn't want. Okay? I didn't get it. But then as we came off the water toward the bayou where his boat got docked, there was a sort of a little small hillside, and there were about, I'm going to say, 15 to 20 black guys fishing on this hillside, and they were really poor because they had just poles and string, not even reels. Well, you can't catch a fish that way. It's not going to happen. So my father-in-law says to me as we're coming towards these guys, I'm going to pull the boat up on the shore, take the red box, and dump it out. Dump it off the bow. I'm from California. What do I know? So I did what he said. I picked up the red box, and I went up to the bow, got ready. He pulls up on the shore, and he says, dump it. No, he didn't say. He says to the black guys, y'all want some fish? And they said, yes, sir, mister. He says to me, dump it. I dumped the fish. There's a mess of fish, a lot of fish. And these guys hadn't caught anything. They didn't have anything. And they say, thank you, mister. And he says, y'all are welcome. Get back in the boat and drive away. Is that a racist? It caused me to do some thinking. He died in 1988. I went to his funeral, and at the back of the church were a lot of black people. And nobody would talk to them but me, because I don't care. You know, I'm not from New Orleans. And so I went over to him and I said, were you friends of Fred's? And they said, no, we were his customers. He ran a pest control business, and he turned out, and I learned this at his funeral, he gave services to the black people who couldn't pay for it because they couldn't pay for it. But he would never, ever, ever tell one of his white friends that he had done that. Because if he had, he would have been ostracized. Complicated world, isn't it? Very decent man, trapped in this racist society. But he made some good daughters. Okay. Now, just by way of oversimplification, if you're in the South today and you're dealing with someone my age or older, 70, 80, 90, they're going to say nigger, because that's the way it is. But if you talk to somebody who's 50, 60, they're going to say, we know it's not right, but we don't know any blacks except for servants. And if you talk to somebody who's 30, 40, 50, they're going to say, well, I went to school with blacks, and some of them are okay. And then if you talk to somebody who's in school, whether it's kindergarten or grade school or high school or college, they're going to say, Mama, I want you to meet my friend Letitia. On June 27, 2003, the U.S. Supreme Court issued a stunning 6-3 decision which legalized gay sex. And I spoke to you about that year at that time. The court ruled in Lawrence versus Texas that the Texas law which banned sodomy for homosexuals, but not for heterosexuals, was unconstitutional because it violated the Due Process Clause. And then the court went even further, and it said that all sodomy laws violated the Equal Protection Clause of the U.S. Constitution. Justice Anthony Kennedy, the swing guy on the court, wrote the decision. And what he said is this, and I'm quoting, "The petitioners are entitled to respect for their private lives. The state cannot demean their existence or control their destiny by making their private sexual conduct a crime. Their right to liberty under the Due Process Clause gives them the full right to engage in their conduct without the intervention of government." Close quote. In that opinion, Justice Kennedy went out of his way to repudiate an earlier and an opposite decision of the Supreme Court, namely the Bowers case. And what he said was this: Bowers was not correct when it was decided, it is not correct today, and it is hereby overruled. One of the attorneys on the case said this, and I quote him, "I think this is a truly historic and informative decision. In years to come, it will be seen as a turning point for liberty for everybody." Now, some years ago, under George W. Bush, and most of you know this, Congress passed a law called the Defense of Marriage Act. And that law, among other things, prohibited the federal government from recognizing same-sex marriages in states where they were legal, such as New York. And what that means, and it's especially significant for me as an estate planning attorney, and I represent gays, and what this means is that people in a gay marriage, which is perfectly 100% legal, cannot get federal benefits. And those benefits include survivors' benefits for Social Security, estate tax deductions that married couples in traditional marriages enjoy, and on and on and on. Okay? These are significant monetary benefits which are enjoyed by traditional spouses, but were systematically denied to same-sex couples at the federal level in this country. Just last week, the United States Court of Appeal for the Second Circuit, sitting in Manhattan, ruled in the case of Windsor versus the United States that the part of the Defense of Marriage Act that prohibited the federal government from recognizing legal same-sex marriages was absolutely unconstitutional. It's a big deal, this case. That decision was a 2-to-1 decision, but significantly, the chief judge, Dennis Jacobs, wrote the opinion for the majority. And Jacobs was a conservative appointed by George W. Bush. That's significant to me. And he wrote that opinion for the majority. Now, in recent years, other courts, since the Lawrence versus Taylor case, there has just been a tremendous amount of litigation by the gay community, and it's been successful, by and large, and it should be. In recent years, other courts have made like rulings, and they have slowly and methodically advanced the legal rights of gays. And today, the pressure is on the U.S. Supreme Court, because this case that I'm telling you about, Windsor versus the United States, undoubtedly is going to be appealed. And the only place to appeal it is the United States Supreme Court. And guess what's sitting on their docket? The Proposition 8 case from California, where we voted that same-sex marriage was okay. And that's been upheld by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals and it's on its way. It's sitting in the Supreme Court now, but so now is going to be the Windsor case. And this is the same court with these same conservative justices that ruled in Lawrence versus Texas that you can't outlaw homosexual sex. So I think my prediction is, and you heard it here, okay, that the U.S. Supreme Court is ultimately going to rule that any law that treats gay people differently in this country as unconstitutional is going to get struck down. Now, that sweeping ruling may not come in this term, but it will undoubtedly come within the next 5 years. And I don't mean to be political about this, I'm just stating the obvious. If Obama is reelected and he gets to make appointments to the court, it will absolutely occur as soon as possible. There's no question about it. Now, we all know the mandate of Leviticus 19:18, which is the golden rule. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Putting that rule into practice has proven difficult throughout history, because the reality is, for most people, is that we love those of our neighbors who are like us. Others are tolerated, some are despised. Overall, as the human race, we have not done a very great job implementing the golden rule. Now, the legal decisions that I just cited to you this morning, Brown versus the Board of Education, which struck down school segregation, Lawrence versus Taylor, which struck down sodomy laws, and now the case of Windsor versus the United States, which struck down the federal discrimination against gays in the Defense of Marriage Act. These are all decisions which are based on fundamental Judeo-Christian values. The decisions were anchored in the Golden Rule. They were framed by the ideals of tolerance and compassion. It's noteworthy and perhaps a bit ironic that it is the high courts of our country now, in their collective wisdom, which have reminded us as a nation that we should not judge others. To put this all into perspective, remember what the Tin Man said to Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz? We're not in Kansas anymore. Remember? Well, the days of Ozzie and Harriet, in which emotions were stifled, segregation was the law of the land, and gays had no rights, are thankfully long gone. Thank you for your attention.